Neuroanatomy presents Gross Anatomy of the Brain. Welcome to another episode of Neuroanatomy. Today, we will be discussing the gross anatomy of the brain, specifically its division, the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. So let's start. The brain is part of the central nervous system that lies inside the cranial cavity. It is continuous with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. So here is an example of our skull. Inside the cranial cavity is where we can find our brain, and it's continuous with the spinal cord. So the opening here at the base of the skull, this is the foramen magnum. So the brain can be divided into major parts. We have the forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. So the forebrain contains the cerebrum, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. And then we have here the midbrain. And then the hindbrain, we have the pons, the medulla oblongata, and the cerebellum. So the midbrain and the hindbrain are collectively called as the brainstem. So the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain. It consists of two cerebral hemispheres connected by a mass of white matter called the corpus callosum. So here is our right and left hemispheres. So it is connected by a white matter at the center. Um, this is our corpus callosum. So each hemisphere extends from the frontal to the occipital bones above the anterior and middle cranial fossa and posteriorly above the tentorium cerebelli. So the hemispheres are separated by a deep cleft, the longitudinal fissures marked by red marker, into which projects the falx cerebri. So taking note of this fissure is where we can find this one, our falx cerebri. The surface layer of each hemisphere is called um, the cortex and is composed of gray matter. So cortex is thrown into folds or gyrus separated by fissures or sulci, as you can appreciate here in our example of a human brain. Several of the large sulci conveniently subdivide the surface of each hemispheres into lobes. So our lobes are named for the bones of the cranium under which they lie. Syempre, obviously naman. So we have here the frontal lobe. Kaya madali lang nating ma-memorize because um, yun nga, kung for what bone ang nasa tapat nila, yun din ang name ng lobe natin. So we have the frontal lobe situated in front of the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus. And then we also have the parietal lobe situated behind the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus. We also have the occipital lobe, lies below the parieto-occipital sulcus. And then lastly, we have the temporal lobe. It is below the lateral sulcus. So the precentral gyrus lies immediately anterior to the central sulcus and is known as the motor area. So saan nga ba yung ating central sulcus? So this is the brain, our brain, side view niya. So at take note of this, the division or the line between the green part or colored green and the orange is our central sulcus. So here is our central sulcus. So immediately in anterior to the central sulcus is our motor area. So large motor nerve cells in this area control voluntary movements in the opposite side of the body. Most nerve fibers cross over to the opposite side in the medulla oblongata as they descend to the spinal cord. So in the motor area, the body is, oh, I'm so sorry. In the motor area, the body is represented in an inverted position, with the nerve cells controlling the movements of the feet located in the upper part and those controlling the movements of the face and hands in the lower part. So the postcentral gyrus lies immediately posterior to the central sulcus and is known as the sensory area. So we have a diagram here. So we have the central sulcus here. So we have the just anterior to it is the motor cortex, and the posterior to the central gyrus is our sensory cortex. So the postcentral gyrus lies immediately posterior to the central sulcus and is known as the sensory area. The small nerve cells in this area receive and interpret sensations of pain, temperature, touch, pressure from the opposite side of the body. Take note that it is opposite side of the body. The superior temporal gyrus lies immediately below the lateral sulcus. The middle of this gyrus is concerned with the reception and interpretation of sound and is known as the auditory association area. So our auditory area. So we also have the Broca's area or the motor speech area, which lies just above the lateral sulcus. It controls the movements employed in speech, dominant in the left hemispheres in right-handed persons and in right hemispheres in left-handed persons. So as we can see, here is our Broca's area or the motor speech area. And this is our lateral sulcus. So, sabi dito, lies above our lateral sulcus. So, lateral sulcus and above it, our Broca's area. So, we also have the visual area, which is situated on the posterior pole, visual area, pole and medial aspect of the cerebral hemisphere in the region of calcarine sulcus. It is the receiving area for visual impressions. The cavity present within each cerebral hemisphere is called the lateral ventricle. The lateral ventricles communicate with the third ventricle through the interventricular foramina. So we proceed to the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is almost completely hidden from the surface of the brain. So if we go back kanina sa ating discussion about the divisions of the brain, if we go back here, we can see that the forebrain contains cerebrum, thalamus, and the hypothalamus. So the diencephalon consists is composed of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. Okay, we go back now to our discussion. So the thalamus is a large matter that lies on the either side of the third ventricle. So the yellow mass here is our or thalamus. It is the great release station and the afferent sensory pathway to the cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus forms the lower part of the lateral wall and floor of the third ventricle. So here is our hypothalamus naman din. Here is our hypothalamus naman din. It is marked with red color. So the following structures naman are found in the floor of the third ventricle backward. So we have here the third ventricle. So the structures that are lies near it. So we have here kanina our we have here the mammillary body, the posterior perforated substance, and then the optic chiasma, and then the tuber cinereum. So these structures are found in the floor of the third ventricle backwards. Now we go to the midbrain. So the midbrain is a narrow part of the brain that passes through the tentorial notch and connects the forebrain to the hindbrain. So it connects kaya nga midbrain because it connects the forebrain, our forebrain here, to our hindbrain. So it comprises two lateral halves called the cerebral peduncles. Each of these is divided into anterior part or the crus cerebri and the posterior part, the tegmentum, by a pigmented band of gray matter, the substantia nigra. So we have the cerebral aqueduct. The narrow cavity of the midbrain connects the third and fourth ventricles. We also have the tectum, part of the midbrain posterior to the cerebral aqueduct. It has four small surface swellings. We have two superior and two inferior colliculi. Colliculi are deeply placed between the cerebellum and the cerebral hemispheres. And then we also have the pineal body, highlighted with a red marker. It is a small glandular structure that lies between the superior colliculi. It is attached by a stalk to the region of the posterior wall of the ventricle. Pineal commonly calcifies in middle age, and thus it can be visualized on radiograph.
The hindbrain is located at the base of the brain around the brainstem. It is a collection of lower brain structures that include the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla. What is the function of the hindbrain? So the pons, medulla, and cerebellum control or influence various motor functions, as well as vital automatic responses such as breathing, heart rate, and sleep. So just a quick overview. So first we have the pons. So the pons is located between the midbrain rostrally and the medulla oblongata caudally. So what do you mean by rostrally? So rostrally just means toward the nose or the anterior part of the head, and caudally is the posterior part of the head. So we can see here in the picture the pons. So like we said, it is between the midbrain rostrally. So the midbrain is above the pons or anterior, and the medulla oblongata caudally on the posterior part and inferior part of the pons. So the pons is located in the anterior part of the posterior cranial fossa, and the cranial nerve 5, which is the trigeminal nerve, is associated with the pons. Next, we have the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is the most caudal part of the subdivision of the brainstem that is continuous with the spinal cord. So if you can see my laser, we have here the medulla oblongata. So it just connects the pons and the spinal cord. So it acts as a bridge. It is located on the posterior cranial fossa as well. And the cranial nerve 9, 10, and 12 is associated with the medulla oblongata, while the cranial nerve 6 to 8 is associated with the junction of pons and medulla. The third one is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is a large brain mass lying posterior to the pons and medulla and inferior to the posterior part of the cerebrum. So we have here the large in the picture the large structure, which is the cerebellum, which is on the posterior part of the pons and medulla. So the cerebellum is located beneath the tentorium cerebelli in the posterior cranial fossa. The cerebellum has two lateral hemispheres which is united by a narrow middle part, which will be discussed later on the cerebellum part of this discussion. So first off, we have the pons. So the pons is a small bundle of neural tissue about 2.5 centimeters long, and it is located on the anterior surface of the cerebellum below the midbrain and above the medulla oblongata. So if you can see the picture here, the pons is the yellow part here. The pons is 2.5 centimeters long, as we said a while ago, and the pons is situated anteriorly in the anterior of the cerebellum and the inferior of the midbrain. The blue part is the midbrain, and it is located on the anterior of the medulla oblongata. Here, we have here the medulla oblongata. The pons is composed mainly of nerve fibers, which connects the two divisions of the cerebellum, and it also contains ascending and descending fibers, which connects the forebrain, the midbrain, and the spinal cord. So some of the nerve cells within the pons serve as relay stations, whereas others from nerve nuclei. So next. So what is the function of the pons? So the pons is involved in sleeping and dreaming, and as well as helping control breathing and other muscle movements. It also connects parts of the brain with one another by relaying messages between the cerebral cortex and cerebellum, and between the medulla and the midbrain. So it acts like a messenger between the cerebral cortex, cerebellum, and the medulla and the midbrain. So second, we have the medulla oblongata or the medulla. So the medulla oblongata is conical in shape. In the picture above, we have here the medulla oblongata, and it resembles a cone. So the medulla oblongata connects the pons above to the spinal cord below. So as we discussed a while ago, we said that it acts as a bridge between the pons and the spinal cord. So this connects the pons to the spinal cord below. The medulla consists of a median fissure on its anterior surface. So on the picture below, we can see this fissure here in the median, which we call the median fissure as well. So on each side, we have swellings, which we call pyramids. So the pyramid is composed of bundles of nerve fibers that originate in large nerve cells in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex. So the pyramid taper below. So which we can see here in the picture. So the pyramid parang pumapayat siya. So it becomes thin as it descends. So here, most of the descending fibers cross to the opposite sides, forming the decushion of the pyramids. So here which we call the decushion. Here it is the junction of the junction of the spinal cord and the hindbrain. So here the nerve fibers crosses on the opposite side. So next, we also have the olives. So the olives is located on the posterior to the pyramid, so it is covered by the pyramids. So we can see here in the picture above, the olives are the green structures, the green oval structures. So olives are oval elevations produced by the underlying olivary nuclei. Also, we have the inferior cerebellar peduncles. We have three peduncles, but we will discuss that on the cerebellum part. So the inferior cerebellar peduncles are located behind the olives. So this connects the medulla to the cerebellum. Here we have the picture of an inferior cerebellar peduncle on the right, on the middle part. The inferior cerebellar peduncle, as we said, that it connects the medulla to the cerebellum. So on the posterior surface of the medulla oblongata are the gracile and the cuneate tubercles, produced by the medially placed underlying nucleus gracilis and the laterally placed nucleus cuneatus. So also we have a picture here which represents the gracile tubercle and the cuneate tubercle. So what is the function of the medulla? So the medulla oblongata controls vital and involuntary bodily functions like swallowing, coughing, heart rate, and much more. So some parts of the medulla are also involved in sensations such as touch and pressure. So lastly, we have the cerebellum. So the cerebellum, which they say is about the size of a tennis ball in adult humans. So imagine the large size of a tennis ball. So it is as big as our cerebellum. So the cerebellum is situated within the posterior cranial fossa, beneath the tentorium cerebelli. So it is located on the posterior to the pons and medulla oblongata. So the cerebellum has two hemispheres as we have discussed, which are the intermediate zone and the lateral zone. Here in the picture above, we have here, we can see the intermediate zone in the middle and the lateral zone on each side. And here in the median, we have the vermis. So the vermis controls the functions, controls motor functions in the actual portions of the body, while intermediate zone control the motor functions on the limbs and facial regions. While lateral zone naman is it functions on the planning and coordinating the body's rapid sequential muscular activities. So we have here the three peduncles, as we mentioned a while ago. First, we have the superior cerebellar peduncle. So, what are peduncles pala? Peduncles are just connectors. It just connects or it connects the cerebellum to other parts of the brain. So we have first the superior cerebellar peduncles, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain, which is represented by the blue part here on the picture below. Next, we have the middle cerebellar peduncles, which connects the cerebellum to the pons, which is represented by the green shaded part. And lastly, we have the inferior cerebellar peduncles, which is represented by this yellow part. Next. So the cerebellar cortex is a surface layer of each cerebellar hemisphere. So it is composed of a gray matter and it is thrown into folds, which we call folia, and is separated by closely set transverse fissures. So certain masses of gray matter are found in the white matter. So the largest of these is known as a dentate nucleus. So what is the function of the cerebellum? The cerebellum plays an important role in the control of muscle tone and the coordination of muscle movement on the same side of the body. So the cerebellum coordinates the fine muscle movements and regulates posture and balance. So although commands for movements occur higher in different areas of the brain, the cerebellum organizes and adjusts muscle activity to help with smooth and precise movement. So this we will be discussing the fourth ventricle as well because it is the cavity of the hindbrain. The fourth ventricle is the cavity of the hindbrain. So it is bounded in front by the pons and the medulla oblongata, which we can see here. So this is the, if you can see my laser, this is the fourth ventricle. So uh, so it is bounded in front by the pons. The pons is located here, and the medulla oblongata below. So it is bounded behind by the superior and inferior medullary villi and the cerebellum. So we also have which we call the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct connects the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle above. So it is below, it is continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So the cerebral aqueduct, if you can see my laser again, is located here between the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. It connects the fourth ventricle to the third ventricle. It is continuous with the central canal on the spinal cord, as we can see here. So the fourth ventricle communicates with the subarachnoid space through three openings of the lower part of the roof, which are the median and two lateral openings. So to finish this lecture, we have a picture here of the anatomy of the brain. So as we discussed, to summarize, we have the pons here, we have the medulla oblongata, the cerebellum, which we said that it is the size of a tennis ball. And below we have an MRI image or MR image of the median sagittal part of the brain. So if you can see, we can identify the structures of the hindbrain. Here we have the pons. We have the medulla oblongata here in the cerebellum. And here we can have the paramedian sagittal MR image. We can also identify here the pons in the cerebellum. So that is all, guys. I hope you learned something from me, and I'm hoping to see you all soon. Goodbye.
Being a fighter is being courageous. And in medical school, we need to be courageous because courage vanishes the crisis. There are many fights we are facing, and we might meet again. Our goals, our dreams, our struggles, our unfocuses will never leave the world, but we must be determined and fight to perform and observe a sense of shared destiny, and that is to help each other and grow our sense of empathy. In achieving this, we should never lose our core. We should never lose our character, because this is the very core and the very character we need in becoming the best in our chosen fields. We should commit ourselves to becoming fighters and staying fighters.
So in this episode of Neuroanatomy, we will be discussing the central nervous system. In the end of this episode, you will learn and understand the divisions of the nervous system. So okay, let's start. So before proceeding to the central nervous system proper, let me do a quick recap of the nervous system. So the layout of the nervous system, we have two parts. We have the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and also the peripheral nervous system, which consists of the nerves radiating out of the central nervous system. So the nervous system is so organized because the central nervous system receives the sensory input and delivers motor output to the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system consists of two parts. We have the somatic. So this somatic receives and sends information to the skeletal muscles, and also the autonomic nervous system, which sends and receives information from the visceral organs. So the autonomic nervous system is further subdivided into three parts. We have the sympathetic nervous system. So this sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight and flight response of the body, and the parasympathetic nervous system is responsible for the rest and digest of the body, and also the enteric nervous system, which is the own nervous system of the GI tract. So how does the nervous system functions? So the nervous system has a sensory function. So this sensory function, we sense changes through the sensory receptors, and the motor, which respond to stimuli, and the most important function is the integrative, which analyze incoming sensory information, store some aspects, and make decisions regarding behavior. So the fundamental unit of operation is the neuron, which typically consists of a cell body, several dendrites, and the single axon. So dito, these neurons are excitable cells of the nervous system. So the structures consist of the cell body. So itong cell body, this consists of the nucleus and other cell organelles. The dendrites, which are processes that extends from the cell body, and the single axon, which responsible for the output information. So we can see here that the axon is enclosed in a myelin sheet. So this myelin sheet is composed of layer of cells, and this speeds up. This helps the nerve impulses to to be conducted at a faster rate po. And lastly, the axon terminals. So this axon terminal is important because this axon terminals contains the synapses. And we classify neurons based on its structure and function. So structure, we base it on the number of processes extending from the cell body. So we have the multipolar neurons. So these multipolar neurons, we have several processes extending from the soma. And the bipolar neurons, we have two processes extending from the soma. And unipolar neurons, we have only one process that extends from the soma. And functionally, we classify neurons as sensory or afferent neurons. So these afferent neurons will go toward the nervous system and bring information into the nervous system. Motor afferent neurons naman, their function is they're going to take that information away from the central nervous system. And the interneurons, these interneurons are occur between afferent and afferent neurons, and they are found both in the central and peripheral nervous system. So other than excitable cells, we also have neuroglia, which are cells that are electrically excitable, not electrically excitable. So they make up approximately half the volume of the nervous system. So these neuroglia are different from other nerve cells because they can multiply and divide. So these neuroglia they have 6 kinds in total. So 4 are located in the central nervous system, and 2 are located in the peripheral nervous system. So since we are assigned to discuss only the central nervous system, we discuss the 4 types. First, we have the astrocytes. So astrocyte, because they are star-shaped. So they are important because they establish the blood-brain barrier. Next is the ependymal cells. So these cells line the ventricles of the brain and the central canal. So they are important because they synthesize cerebrospinal fluid, and also they maintain the cerebrospinal barrier. Next is the oligodendrocytes. So they are important because they create a myelin sheath. So as discussed a while ago, this myelin sheath conduct impulses and they speed up the process of conduction. Lastly, the microglial cells. So they phagocyze cell debris from damaged tissues, and also they attack invading microbes. So synapses. So this synapses, the junction between neurons, or the junction between a neuron and an effector. So information is transmitted in the central nervous system, mainly in the form of nerve action potentials called nerve impulses to a succession of neurons one after another. So there are 2 types of synapses. We have the chemical and electrical. So we proceed first to the less known, which is the electrical synapse. So in this electrical synapse, we can see that there are gap junctions between cells. So these gap junctions will allow transfer of information in order to synchronize the activity of group of cells. So this electrical synapse is common in the heart po. And we move on to the chemical synapse, which is a more common type of synapse. So in this, there is a one-way transfer of information from a presynaptic neuron at its axon terminal and the postsynaptic neuron at its dendrites po. So in the presynaptic axon, we see here important structures. We have the synaptic vesicles. So these synaptic vesicles contain neurotransmitters. So this neurotransmitter will be So this neurotransmitter will elicit some type of response to the postsynaptic neuron. So there are several different types of neuron-to-neuron synapses. So these are not included in this slide. So I'll just say it to you. So there are, first is the axoaxonic. So axoaxonic is the synapse between one axon and another axon. So next is the axodendritic. So this one is more common. So the axon of the presynaptic neuron interconnects with the dendrites of the postsynaptic neuron. And lastly, the axosomatic. The axosomatic is the axon of the presynaptic neuron is interconnected with the soma or the cell body of the postsynaptic neuron. Next is the summation. So summation is several presynaptic end bulbs release many neurotransmitters. So this combined effects will generate a nerve impulse called summation. So there are two types of summation. We have the spatial summation. So this is spatial summation. The postsynaptic neuron will receive signal from multiple sources, in contrary to temporal summation, which will only receive multiple signals from one source. So these, we have chemical substances that function as synaptic transmitter. We have this small molecule. This small molecule neurotransmitters are fast acting, while the neuropeptides or the larger particles, larger neurotransmitters are slow acting. So in this, removal of neurotransmitter. So there are three ways to remove neurotransmitter in the synaptic cleft. So first is the diffusion. So the neurotransmitter will simply diffuse out of the neurons. So next is the enzymatic degradation. So as we can remember, in the neuromuscular junction, there are substances called acetylcholinesterase. So this acetylcholinesterase will degrade the acetylcholine in the synaptic cleft. And finally, the neurotransmitter will be taken up into the cells and will be removed from this manner. So there are some special characteristics of synaptic transmission. So sa fatigue, when excitatory synapses are repetitively stimulated at a rapid rate, the number of discharges from the postsynaptic neuron is at first very great. But in the succeeding seconds, this will cause fatigue, and the firing rate will become progressively less in succeeding milliseconds or seconds. Next is effect of acidosis or alkalosis of synaptic transmission. So most neurons are highly responsive sa pH ng interstitial fluid. So when the interstitial fluid is alkalotic, this will increase the excitability of neurons, while when the interstitial fluid is acidotic, this will decrease the excitability of neurons. Next is effect of hypoxia on synaptic transmission. So oxygen is really important in the neuronal excitability. So for example, when the person's brain's blood flow is interrupted, so this can cause fainting or collapsing of the patient. So few seconds lang na walang oxygen in the brain, this will cause complete inexcitability of the neurons po. And next, effect of drugs on synaptic transmission. So for example, is caffeine. So this caffeine is found in coffee. So this caffeine in coffee will increase the excitability of neurons, and this will reduce the threshold excitability for the neurons po. And synaptic delay. So during transmission of neuronal signal from presynaptic neuron to a postsynaptic neuron, a certain amount of time is consumed in the process of first discharge of transmitter substance by the presynaptic terminal. Second is diffusion of the transmitter to the postsynaptic neuronal membrane. Third is the action of the transmitter on the membrane receptor. For action of the receptor to increase membrane permeability. And lastly, the inward diffusion of potassium to raise the excitatory postsynaptic potential to a high enough level to elicit an action potential. So we go to the lecture proper. So we have the central nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So it is central. It is called central because it is situated in the center of the body, and it is also the information and integration center of the human body. So it is referred to as central because it combines information from the entire body and coordinates activity across the whole organism. So the structures involved in the central nervous system, we have the brain, forebrain, cerebrum, diencephalon, midbrain, hindbrain, medulla oblongata, pons cerebellum, and the spinal cord segments, which will be discussed later. So three major levels of the central nervous system have a specific functional characteristic. We have the spinal cord level, lower brain or subcortical level, higher brain, or the cortical level. First is the spinal cord function. In order to maintain homeostasis, the spinal cord must propagate nerve impulses and integrate formation. So the neuronal circuits in the cord can cause walking movements, reflexes that withdraw portions of the body from painful objects, reflexes that stiffen the legs to support the body against gravity, and reflexes that control local blood vessels and gastrointestinal movements or urinary excretion. So how does information travel in the spinal cord? So we have two important structures found in the spinal cord. We have the white matter and the gray matter. So yung white matter, they're going to conduct nerve impulses to and from the brain, and the gray matter, which are going to receive and integrate incoming and outgoing information to perform spinal reflexes. So next is the lower brain or subcortical level. We have the medulla, pons, mesencephalon, hypothalamus, thalamus cerebellum, and basal ganglia. So many subconscious activities are integrated here. And also, dito, they initiate wakefulness in the cerebral cortex. So dito, lower brain or subcortical level. So for example, is during subconscious control of arterial pressure. So this subconscious control of arterial pressure is they are achieved mainly in the medulla and pons. So another one is control of equilibrium. So control of equilibrium is a combined functions of the older portions of the cerebellum, medulla, pons, and mesencephalon, and also feeding reflexes. So feeding reflexes, for example, is salivation and also licking of the lips. So these are controlled by the areas in the medulla, pons, and mesencephalon. Lastly is the higher brain or cortical level. So this cerebral cortex is an extremely large memory storehouse. So sabi dito, the cortex never functions alone, but always in association with lower centers of the nervous system. So without this cortex, lahat ng galaw or lahat ng functions ng body natin is imprecise. So kailangan siya in order to maintain determinative and precise functions of the body and operations po.
So we move on to the division of central nervous system, the spinal cord and the brain. So spinal cord is situated within the vertebral canal of the vertebral column and is surrounded by three meninges, the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. So brief description for these three meninges. For the pia mater, it is the innermost of the meninges. It is a thin membrane that covers the spinal cord. For arachnoid mater, the middle layer. Lastly, the dura mater is the outermost layer of the meninges that surround the spinal cord. So in addition, further protection is provided by the cerebrospinal fluid, which surrounds the spinal cord in the subarachnoid space. The spinal cord is roughly cylindrical and begins superiorly at the foramen magnum in the skull, where it is continuous with the medulla oblongata of the brain. In addition, spinal nerves communicate between the spinal cord and the body. The inferior end of the spinal cord and spinal nerves exiting there resemble a horsetail and are collectively called the cauda equina. The spinal cord tapers off into the corus medullaris, from the apex of which prolongation of the pia mater, the filum terminale, descends to attach to the back of the coccyx. Along the entire length of the spinal cord are attached 31 pairs of spinal nerves. By the anterior or motor roots, and the posterior or sensory roots. Each root is attached to the cord by a series rootlets which extend the whole length of the corresponding segment of the cord. Each posterior nerve root possesses a posterior root ganglion, the cells of which give rise to the peripheral and central nerve fibers. So for the structure of spinal cord, the spinal cord is composed of an inner core of gray matter, which is surrounded by an outer covering of white matter. The gray matter is seen on cross-section as an H-shaped pillar with anterior and posterior gray columns or holes, united by the thin gray commissure containing the small central canal. So for the next division of central nervous system is the brain. In this part, we already discussed this in the first episode, which is the gross anatomy of the brain. So I will give an overview again about the brain. So the brain lies in the cranial cavity and is continuous with the spinal cord through the foramen magnum. The brain controls our thoughts, memories, speech, movement of the arms and the legs, and the function of many organs within our body. It is surrounded by three meninges also, the dura mater, the arachnoid mater, and the pia mater. These are continuous with the corresponding meninges of the spinal cord. The cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the brain in the subarachnoid space. The brain is conventionally divided into three major divisions. These are in ascending order from the spinal cord: the hindbrain, subdivided into medulla oblongata, the pons, and the cerebellum. The midbrain and the forebrain may also subdivided into the diencephalon and cerebrum. And lastly, the brainstem, a collectively term for the medulla oblongata, pons, and midbrain. The first division is the hindbrain. Under this is the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata is conical in a shape. It is the most inferior portion of the brainstem and is continuous with the spinal cord. It extends from the level of the foramen magnum to the pons. In addition to ascending and descending nerve tracts, the medulla oblongata contains discrete nuclei with specific functions, such as regulation of heart rate, blood vessels diameter, breathing, swallowing, vomiting, coughing, sneezing, balance, and coordination. So for the next is the pons. It contains ascending and descending nerve tracts as well as several nuclei, some nuclei in the pons between the cerebellum and the cerebellum. Not only the pons is a functional bridge between the cerebellum and cerebellum, but on the anterior surface, it resembles an arcuate with several nuclei of the medulla oblongata. Described earlier extend in the lower part of the pons, so functions such as breathing, swallowing, and balance are controlled in the lower pons, as well as in the medulla oblongata. Other nuclei in the pons contain functions such as chewing and salivation. The next one is cerebellum. It's attached to the brainstem by several large connections called cerebellar peduncle. This connection provides route of communication between the cerebellum and other parts of the CNS. In addition, cerebellum is for coordinating movement. Most body movements require the coordination of multiple muscle groups. The cerebellum times muscles action so that the body can move smoothly. For the vision, the cerebellum coordinates eye movements. For motor learning, the cerebellum helps the body to learn movements that require practice and fine-tuning. So next division is the midbrain. The midbrain, just superior to the pons, is the smallest region of the brainstem. The dorsal part of the midbrain consists of 4 mounds called the colliculi. So in addition, the 2 inferior colliculi are major relay centers for the auditory nerve pathway in the CNS. The 2 superior colliculi are involved in visual reflexes and receive touch and auditory input. Turning the head toward a tap on the shoulder, a sudden loud noise, or a bright flash of light is reflex controlled in the superior colliculi. The midbrain contains nuclei involved in coordinating eye movements and controlling pupil diameter and lens shape. The midbrain also contains a black nuclear mass called the substantia nigra, which is part of the basal nuclei and is involved in regulating general body movement. So for the last division is the forebrain. Under this is diencephalon. Diencephalon is the part of the brain between the brainstem and the cerebrum. Its main components are the thalamus, the epithalamus, and the hypothalamus. For the cerebrum, it is the largest part of the brain, and it is divided into left and right hemisphere by longitudinal fissure. The most conspicuous features on the surface of each hemisphere are numerous folds called gyri, which greatly increase the surface area of the cortex, and intervening grooves called sulci. And lastly, the brainstem. The brainstem connects the spinal cord to the remainder of the brain. It consists of the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. The brainstem contains several nuclei involved in vital body function, such as the control of the heart rate, blood pressure, and breathing.
So for the peripheral nervous system, okay, let us review first. So it was mentioned a while ago that our nervous system is divided into 2 anatomical divisions. The first one is the central nervous system. So they have mentioned that central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Again, it consists of the brain and the spinal cord. So any other components now, aside from the brain and the spinal cord, belongs to the peripheral nervous system. All right? So the question now is, what is the function of the peripheral nervous system? Or what are the components of the peripheral nervous system? All right. Peripheral nervous system contains the axons of efferent and they consist of the efferent and afferent axons. So what do we mean by afferent and efferent axons? So any sensory impulses or any impulses coming from our sense organs going to our spinal cord or to our central nervous system is afferent. You get the point? So these afferent axons conduct sensory impulse or sensory information to the spinal cord. Alright? And this efferent naman po, this efferent division, transmit impulses coming from the central nervous system to our muscles. Alright? To our muscles. Now, given that information, it is now clear that the function of the peripheral nervous system is to connect the central nervous system with our limbs. You get the point? So it essentially serves as a connection between the brain and spinal cord and the rest of the body. So again, our peripheral nervous system consists now of the nerves and the ganglia outside the central nervous system. So, sabi natin kanina, so again, our peripheral nervous system consists of the nerves and the ganglia that is located outside the central nervous system. So again, there is the afferent and there is the efferent. Afferent from our periphery going to our brain, and efferent is from our CNS going to our periphery. And that signal coming from our brain going to our periphery, which is transmitted by our efferent nerve fibers, all right, is now subdivided into the voluntary and involuntary. Kasi sabi natin, it will relay signal, it will transmit signals to the muscles. Si efferent, it transmits signals to the muscles. But what muscles will you govern? If you will be governing cardiac muscle and smooth muscles, you are under autonomic nervous system because you are involuntary. But if you are now governing a skeletal muscles, you are under the somatic nervous system because you are voluntary. So what is the difference now between autonomic nervous system and the somatic nervous system? So the main difference now of our somatic nervous system and autonomic nervous system is that our somatic nervous system is a one neuron system, while our autonomic, on the other hand, is a two neuron system. So what do we mean by one neuron system? What do we mean by two neuron system? So ang ating one neuron system ay si somatic nervous system. It only has one neuron, or it only consists of one neuron to transmit signals to our effector organ. Ibig sabihin, it doesn't have the preganglionic and the postganglionic, or sa madaling salita, walang ganglia or walang ganglion. Alright? If the dendrites will receive the nerve impulses, it will transmit through our axon until the release of our acetylcholine neurotransmitter, and it will have a stimulatory effect to our skeletal muscle. Again, what made somatic nervous system voluntary? Because of the effector organ, skeletal muscle, which are voluntary in nature. Under naman po the autonomic nervous system, it's a two neuron system because there is now the preganglionic before the ganglion and the postganglionic or the after the ganglion. All right. So what is the difference, sir, between the preganglionic and the postganglionic? Okay. Under autonomic nervous system, we all know that there is the rest and digest, the parasympathetic nervous system, and the fight or flight, the sympathetic nervous system. Tingnan po natin, both of their preganglionic nerve are myelinated. However, under sympathetic, okay, short po ang preganglionic niya. Long naman under parasympathetic. And the postganglionic axon naman po of the sympathetic is long,
while the postganglionic naman po of our parasympathetic is short. Okay? But ano yung sinishare nila na the same characteristic? Both of their preganglionic axons are myelinated and both of their postganglionic axons are non-myelinated. All right. So technically, that is the main difference between the neuron system of the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So it was also mentioned in our physiology, the special ganglion under the sympathetic nervous system, which is the adrenal medulla. All right? Okay. So this is an example of a peripheral nerve or a nerve fiber in the peripheral nervous system. So in each nerve fiber, we all know that there is the presence of a core, and that core is called now as the axis cylinder. In that axis cylinder, there is the myelin sheath. Okay? That myelin sheath is formed by Schwann cells. So, guys, it's very important to note that the myelin in the axon is formed by the Schwann cells because this is a notable characteristic of the nerve of the peripheral nervous system. If the myelin sheath is produced by or it is formed by the Schwann cells, then that nerve belongs to the peripheral nervous system because the formation of myelin or myelin sheath in the central nervous system or the nerves of central nervous system is not produced naman by the Schwann cells. Rather, it is produced by the oligodendrocytes. All right. Okay. There is also the presence of plasma membrane that surrounds the core or it surrounds the axis cylinder, and that is what we call now the axolemma. Okay. Now, this axon is myelinated and Schwann cells produce the myelin sheath or the myelin that insulated the axons. All right. There is also a connective tissue that encapsulates or covers our myelinated axon, and that is what we call endoneurium. So the connective tissue now that encapsulates our axon is endoneurium. All right. A collection of nerve fibers or axons is bundled in what we call fasciculus or the fascicles. And the connective tissue that encapsulates or surrounds that fascicle is called the perineurium. And the collection of fascicles makes now the collection of our fascicles makes now our peripheral nerve. And the connective tissue that surrounds or covers that peripheral nerve is now called as the epineurium. All right, so this is just another illustration of the axis cylinder, of the axon, of the myelin sheath. Oh, here is the endoneurium that covered the myelinated axon, and the bundle of that is called the fascicle. And the connective tissue that covers the fascicle is called the perineurium. And now the collection of fascicles is what makes now the whole peripheral nerve, and is covered now by connective tissue called the epineurium. All right. There are two other components I want to add in the discussion of the gross structure of our peripheral nervous system. So we have here the cranial and spinal nerves and the ganglia. So as we all know naman po that cranial nerves, we have 12 cranial nerves. While our spinal nerves, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. So our cranial nerves originate from our brain, okay, in our brain, and it leaves the brain through or going through the foramina or passing through the foramina of our skull. So our 31 pairs naman of spinal nerves are attached to our spinal cord. Okay. So puntahan natin si 12 cranial nerves. during our previous lectures in other subjects, we have discussed the cranial nerve's name, and we memorized that by using a mnemonic. So if matatandaan natin, but first of all, spinal accessory or the accessory, okay, so andyan po siya, si vestibulocochlear, sometimes it is also named as the acoustic. Okay? Alright. So, if matatandaan natin yung mnemonic, it is O to touch and feel a girl's V. So, I will not say the V because we are recorded. So heavenly. Again, O to touch and feel a girl's V. So heavenly. But another equally important mnemonic is, of course, knowing if it's a sensory, if it's motor in action, or a mixed one. So, if matatandaan po natin, okay, if matatandaan natin, may mnemonic din tayo dyan. So, it's some says, marry, money. But, my brother says, big brain matters more. Okay? So, ayan, some says marry money, but my brother says big brain matter most. So, kapag S yan, it means it is sensory. If it's M, it is motor. If it's B, it is both sensory and motor. So, these are two important mnemonics po. The O to touch and feel a girl's V, so heavenly. Okay, a mnemonic to understand or to memorize the cranial nerve name. And the some says marry money, but my brother says big brain matters more. That is the mnemonic for us to be able to memorize and know if that certain cranial nerve number is a sensory or a motor, or in some cases it's both sensory and motor. Okay? So for our spinal nerves naman po, so there are 31 pairs of our spinal nerves which leaves the spinal cord through the intervertebral foramina in the vertebral column. So the spinal nerves are named according to the regions of the vertebral column with which they are associated. So for example, the cervical, the thoracic, the lumbar, the sacral, and the coccygeal. So for the cervical nerves, we have 8 pairs. For the thoracic nerves, we have 12 pairs. For both lumbar and sacral, we have 5 pairs and a pair for the coccygeal nerve. So let us also note that there are 8 cervical nerves and only 7 vertebrae, and that there are 1 coccygeal nerve and there are 4 coccygeal vertebrae. We also have here our sensory ganglia and the autonomic ganglia. So when we say po the sensory ganglia, these are fusiform swellings situated on the posterior root of each spinal nerve just proximal to the root's junction with a corresponding anterior root. So they are referred to as the posterior root ganglia. Okay, so remember there is a swelling or there are fusiform swellings on the posterior root of each spinal nerve. So similar ganglia that are also found along the course of cranial nerves 5, 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all called sensory ganglia of these nerves. Okay. For the autonomic ganglia, which are often irregular in shape, they are situated naman along the course of efferent nerve fibers of the autonomic nervous system. They are found in the paravertebral sympathetic chains around the roots of the great visceral arteries in the abdomen and close to or embedded within the walls of various viscera. All right, so that is for our sensory and autonomic ganglia.
As we end our report, together with my group mates, we would like to share this one to you, that medical education doesn't really exist to provide students with a way of making a living, but to ensure the health of the community. Student doctors, we should always remember the very core, the reasons, and the foundation why we have taken this endeavor, why we've taken this path of dreaming or of achieving to become a doctor later on. Because there will be sleepless nights, there will be toxic days, there will be various devastation we could feel later on along the way. But during those times that we feel that one, we must always go back to the core. We must always go back to the reasons. We must always go back to the foundation why we wanted to become a doctor. Because this will humble us and this will remind us the very essence of healthcare, the very essence of our dreams of becoming doctors. With that, we end our report.
Neuroanatomy presents Blood Supply of the Brain. In this episode of Neuroanatomy, we will be discussing the arterial supply of the brain. In the end of this episode, you will learn and understand the blood supply of the brain. Okay, let's start. The arteries of the brain supply 15% of the cardiac output to the brain. So the brain receives about 15% resting cardiac output and accounts 20% of the oxygen used by the body. So the arteries provide the brain with 20% of the oxygen which is used by the body. Our brain have a normal blood flow of 50 milliliters per 100 grams of brain tissue per minute. And the brain is supplied by two sets of branches from dorsal aorta, namely the internal carotid artery and the vertebral arteries. The four arteries lie within the subarachnoid and their branches anastomose on the inferior surface of the brain to form the circle of Willis. So let me give you a little emphasis on this. So this formation of circle of Willis, so dito po siya part. Ito po yung sa may formation ng circle of Willis. So this formation is the central communication that unites the two blood vessels, the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries. These internal carotid and vertebrobasilar arteries are the two main vessels that supplies the brain. So the circle of Willis functions as pressure relief system to accommodate the increase or raise intracranial pressure. So in this picture, the internal carotid artery. So this internal carotid artery, take a look on this dashed line. So the dashed line that goes up to the temporal lobe on top of the occipital lobe, this is the internal carotid artery area, internal carotid artery supply. So this internal carotid artery is responsible for supplying large portion of the anterior circulation of the brain. So like the telencephalon, which consists the cerebral hemisphere, and the diencephalon, which consists of the epithalamus, thalamus, subthalamus, hypothalamus, and third ventricle. In this next picture, this shows the path where the vertebrobasilar artery goes. So in this picture, this vertebral artery, ito po, ascends up, and once it hit the magnum and joined to become the basilar artery, and they supply the posterior circulation of the brain. So this blood vessel supplies the brainstem and cerebellum, or in short, the posterior circulation of the brain. So the blood supply of the brain has various branches from its two main vessels, namely the internal carotid artery. And this internal carotid artery has the following branches: the ophthalmic artery, posterior communicating artery, anterior cerebral artery, anterior communicating artery, and the middle cerebral artery. And for the other vessel, which is the vertebrobasilar arteries, it has two main particular vessels also, the vertebral artery and the basilar artery. And under vertebral artery are the posterior inferior cerebellar, anterior spinal artery. While for the basilar artery, it has the following branches: anterior inferior cerebellar artery, superior cerebellar artery, and the posterior cerebral artery. So let's start with the internal carotid artery. So this internal carotid artery enters the cranium via this carotid canal. So dito po siya mag-i-start, and it will continue to the it will arise now here in the neck from the common carotid artery, wherein it ascends in the neck and enter the carotid canal and traverse the foramen lacerum and terminate as the middle and anterior cerebral arteries, which anastomose with the arterial cycle of Willis. So the internal carotid artery at the bifurcation of this common carotid artery. So the common carotid artery bifurcates into internal carotid artery and the external carotid artery. For the external carotid artery, this supplies now the following. It is the face and the scalp area, while the internal carotid artery will continue to move into the base of the skull. So the internal carotid artery supplies tributaries to the dura, hypophysis, tympanic cavity, and trigeminal ganglion. This also provides direct branches to the optic nerve, optic chiasm, hypothalamus, and genu of the internal capsule. This artery divides into the following branches. So let us recall: the ophthalmic artery, the posterior communicating artery, the anterior cerebral artery, the anterior communicating artery, and lastly, the middle cerebral artery. This is the picture wherein the arterial supply of the internal carotid artery. So let's start with ophthalmic artery. So this artery arises as the internal carotid artery emerges from the cavernous sinus and supplies the eye and other orbital structures. It supplies other orbital structures, and its terminal branches supply frontal areas of scalp, the ethmoid, and the frontal sinuses, and the dorsum of the nose. So this is where the ophthalmic artery is located. A certain branch is also focused in this, which is the central artery of the retina. So the central artery of the retina is one branch of the ophthalmic artery that provides only blood supply of the ophthalmic artery or to the inner layers of the retina. So this central artery of the retina is one branch of the ophthalmic artery that provides only blood supply to the inner layers of the retina. This is an end artery, and when this artery is occluded, it will lead to blindness. So one clinical aspect is what we call the central artery occlusion. So the occlusion of the central artery results into blindness. So typically, this condition occurs in individuals greater than 50 years old. And the most common diseases that are associated with the formation of retinal artery occlusion includes irregular heartbeat, narrowing of the arteries in the neck, heart disease, and blood clotting disorders. So this is the picture that shows the central artery occlusion. So the arrow pointing on a red-colored spot is the cherry red spot in the fovea. It is seen as a circular choroid shape. That's why it is called the cherry red spot. And it's a finding in the macula of the eye in the central retinal artery occlusion. The usual cause of this cherry red spot is embolism, in which it blocks the central retinal artery. For the next one,
This is the next picture. So here, this is the anterior circulation of the brain, and this is the posterior circulation of the brain. And the posterior communicating artery is located here. It arises in the carotid siphon, and it joins the posterior cerebral artery. So it supplies the optic chiasm and tract, hypothalamus, subthalamus, and anterior half of the ventral portion of the thalamus. It is a common site of berry aneurysm. So berry aneurysm is also known as saccular aneurysm. So it looks like this. So it is called berry aneurysm because the shape of the aneurysm looks like a berry. So next, this is the anterior cerebral artery here. To further visualize this is the next picture. This one. This is the anterior view of the brain. We can see here the longitudinal cerebral fissure, the corpus callosum, the internal carotid artery. So, the anterior cerebral artery originates at the bifurcation of the internal carotid artery. So, it gives direct branches to the optic chiasm. So, here. It supplies the medial surface of the frontal and parietal lobes and corpus callosum. It supplies also part of the caudate nucleus and putamen and anterior limb of the internal capsule via the medial straight artery of Hübner. So, the name is the anterior cerebral artery, but it supplies the medial surface. So, it supplies the leg and foot area of the motor and sensory cortices, the paracentral lobule. So, when strokes involving anterior cerebral artery is mentioned, it tends to involve the lower half of the body. Why? Because, as I said earlier, it supplies the medial surface. So, it supplies medially in the hemisphere, and the lower part of the body is the one affected. So next is the anterior choroidal artery. This yellow circle here, but it is very small, is the anterior choroidal artery. To further visualize this one, this is the structure located here. So this is the anterior choroidal artery. It arises from the internal carotid artery. So what does it supply? It supplies the choroid plexus of the temporal horn of the lateral ventricle. It also supplies the hippocampus, amygdala, optic tract, lateral geniculate body, globus pallidus, and the ventral part of the posterior limb of the internal capsule. It also supplies the proximal portion of the optic radiations as they leave the lateral geniculate body to form the Meyer loop. So, we all know that the choroid plexus produces most of the cerebrospinal fluid of the CNS. And why for Meyer loop? Because Meyer loop is the most anterior extension of the
optic radiations in the temporal horn. So next is the anterior communicating artery. So not so much of this information, but the anterior cerebral artery, there are two. This is joined by the anterior communicating artery. And it is the most common site of berry aneurysm. As I mentioned earlier, posterior communicating artery is a common site of aneurysm, of berry aneurysm, while the anterior communicating artery is the most common site of berry aneurysm. So the main function of this anterior communicating artery, it connects the two anterior cerebral artery. So next is the clinical aspect. So one of the characteristic vascular lesions in the artery that makes up the anterior circle of Willis is a type of aneurysm, which I mentioned earlier. It is the berry aneurysm. This is caused by a weakness of the part of the wall of the artery. It causes a local ballooning of the artery. As I showed earlier, it looks like a berry. It often these aneurysms rupture spontaneously, particularly if there is accompanying hypertension. Parang may pumuputok na ugat. Ganun po. So, it tends to appear at the base of the brain where blood vessels meet. So, where does blood vessels meet? It is in the circle of Willis. So, sometimes these aneurysms, naglilik siya ng blood. So, it causes an irritation dun sa meninges and accompanying symptoms of headache. So, again, to remember, it is the most common site of the anterior communicating artery is the most common site of berry aneurysm. So next, this one po is the middle cerebral artery. This one. To further visualize it, here, we can see the internal carotid artery here, and this is the middle cerebral artery. It supplies the lateral convexity of the hemisphere and underlying insula. So it supplies the trunk, the arm, and the face areas of the motor and sensory cortices. So here is another picture. This structure is the medial side. Here is a posterior cerebral artery, and here is the anterior choroidal artery. So we can see here from the posterior cerebral artery, part here po, makikita po yung middle cerebral artery and the caudate nucleus. Here is the putamen. Yan. The middle cerebral artery supplies the caudate nucleus, putamen, globus pallidus, and the anterior and posterior circulation. So, limbs of the internal capsule via the lateral straight arteries. So, the middle cerebral artery also supplies the Broca and the Wernicke speech areas. So from the previous lectures, we all know that the Broca's area and Wernicke's area is for the speech. So next is the blood supply of the brain. Here, the internal carotid and the vertebrobasilar arteries. So I'll just move this one to show. Here, this is mnemonics for ma, pa, o. It's for mama, papa, And here, bad vibes is also a mnemonic for vertebral artery and the basilar artery. To help each of us memorize easily. So, MAPAO for middle cerebral artery, anterior cerebral artery, the posterior and the anterior communicating artery, and the ophthalmic artery. For the vertebrobasilar arteries, Y vertebro for the vertebral, basilar for the basilar artery. So, these two divisions have subdivisions. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery, the anterior spinal artery, and for basilar, the posterior cerebral artery, anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the superior cerebellar artery. So, to add this one, the first letter of each word is pa and pas. Pa, pas. Ma, pa, o. So next, this one is the vertebral artery. This yellow structure here is the vertebral artery. So it is a branch of the subclavian artery. We can see here, this is the subclavian artery, and going up here is a vertebral artery. So vertebral artery is a branch of subclavian artery. So it joins its opposite partner to form the basilar artery. So as I said, it arises from the subclavian artery. It ascends through the transverse foramina of the C1 here, C1, going down to C6 vertebrae, and enter the foramen magnum of the skull. So, for the subdivision of the vertebral artery, the next is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. This one gives rise to the posterior spinal artery. We can see here in the structure below, in the right side, here, the yellow circle here is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. It supplies the dorsolateral zone of the medulla and supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum and the choroid plexus of the fourth ventricle. So, it supplies the medial and inferior vestibular nuclei, inferior cerebellar peduncle, and nucleus ambiguus, intraaxial fibers of the glossopharyngeal nerve and the vagal nerve. So, cranial nerve 9 and cranial nerve 10. And also the spinothalamic tract and the spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract. So next is the anterior spinal artery. It is another subdivision of the vertebral artery. It supplies the anterior portion of the spinal cord. Here, in the structure, we can see a yellow circle. This is the anterior spinal artery. The two vertebral arteries, one of which is usually bigger than the other. So it anastomoses in the midline to form a single anterior spinal artery at the level of the foramen magnum.
So I'm gonna discuss about the basilar artery. The basilar artery is located over here where the arrow is pointed. So it's a large vessel. So the basilar artery is a large vessel that ascends along the ventral surface of the pons. It originates in the midline at the pontomedullary junction from the union of the vertebral arteries. The vessel then travels in a relatively shallow groove on the pons known as the basilar groove within the pontine cistern. The lower half of the bony clivus is ventral to the basilar artery. Consequently, it is referred to as the basilar part of the occipital bone. So along its course, this artery gives off 5 major branches that includes anterior inferior cerebellar artery, internal auditory or what we call labyrinthine artery, superior cerebral artery, pontine and posteromedial arteries. The vessel terminates then at a bifurcation where it gives off the paired posterior cerebral artery that contribute to the circle of Willis. So again, the basilar artery is formed by the two vertebral arteries. The smaller branches include pontine arteries and labyrinthine arteries. The numerous pontine arteries originates from the lateral surface bilaterally of the basilar artery as well as posteromedial arteries from the distal bifurcation. The pontine arteries include penetrating and short circumferential branches that supply the corticospinal tracts and the intraaxial exciting fibers of the abducent nerve, or what we call the cranial nerve 6. While the labyrinthine artery, also known as the auditory artery or internal auditory artery, is a long and slender artery that arises from the basilar artery in 15% of the population. It perfuses the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. So here we can see the labyrinthine artery, or what we call arterial labyrinthinis. So the arrow points on the green color. So this is our labyrinthine artery. So again, the picture shows where the pontine arteries or arteria pontis is located, where the green ones over here. So we're gonna discuss the next branch, which is the anterior inferior cerebellar artery that arises from the proximal part of the basilar artery and is one of the three pairs of arteries that supply the cerebellum. The anterior inferior cerebellar arteries usually originate from each side of the basilar artery about 1 centimeter above the junction of the two vertebral arteries, and it courses laterally. It crosses the 8th cranial nerve within the cerebellopontine angle cistern. This artery then supplies the inferior surface of the cerebellum, the hypothalamus spinal tract, the facial nucleus, the intraaxial fibers, the spinal trigeminal nucleus and tract, vestibular nuclei, cochlear nuclei, intraaxial fibers of the vestibulocochlear nerve, spinothalamic tract, and inferior and middle cerebellar peduncles. This artery then gives rise to labyrinthine artery in 85% of the population. So again, this slide shows where the anterior inferior cerebral artery is located. So as the name implies, or as the word implies, inferior, so it is on the lower part. So in the clinical aspect, a combination of signs and symptoms caused by the disruption of a nerve pathway from the brain to the face and eye on one side of the body results in a decreased pupil size, as you can see on the picture, a drooping eyelid, and decreased sweating on the face affected side of the decreased sweating on the affected side of your face is what we call the Horner syndrome. The underlying causes of Horner syndrome vary greatly and may include tumor, stroke, injury, or underlying diseases affecting the areas surrounding the sympathetic nerves. So another branch is the superior cerebellar artery. Before the basilar artery divides into its terminal branches, it gives off this artery. This artery then emerges in the lateral direction, caudal to the oculomotor nerve, or what we call the cranial nerve 3. It courses around the cerebellar peduncles and passes below the trochlear nerve. It eventually gains access to the superior aspect of the cerebellum, along with the telachoroidae of the third ventricle, the pineal body, the pons, and superior medullary velum. It also forms an anastomosis with derivatives of the inferior cerebellar arteries. This artery then supplies the superior surface of the cerebellum and the cerebellar nuclei. the rostral and lateral bones, including the superior cerebellopeduncles and spinal thalamic tract. So again, this picture shows where the superior cerebellar artery is located. So as the word implies, superior, so it is on the upper part branch. This artery originates from the internal carotid in a fetal origin in 20% of the population. It is formed by bifurcation of the basilar artery, and it provides the major blood supply again to the midbrain. It supplies the posterior half of the thalamus and medial and lateral geniculate bodies, and it also supplies the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, and inferior surface of the temporal lobe, including the hippocampal formation. This artery then give rise to the lateral and medial posterior choroidal arteries, which supply the dorsal thalamus, pineal body, choroid plexus of the third and lateral ventricles. So again, this picture shows where the arteries are located, the arteries that are discussed a while ago. So next slide is the summary. So this table shows the different arteries and where it originates and the structures that it supplies. So first is the vertebral artery. It came from the subclavian artery and it supplies the cerebellum. The posterior inferior cerebellar artery, which comes from the vertebral artery and it supplies the posterior inferior cerebellum. And of course, the basilar artery, which was discussed just a while ago. Again, it is from the both vertebrals and it supplies the brainstem, the cerebrum, and of course, our cerebellum. So its branches are the anterior inferior cerebellar artery that supplies the inferior cerebellum, the superior cerebellar artery that supplies, of course, the superior part of the cerebellum, and the posterior cerebellar artery that supplies the inferior cerebrum and the occipital nerve. This is a continuation. So the posterior communicating artery supplies the cerebral arterial circle, while the internal carotid artery, which comes from, of course, the common carotid artery, supplies the cerebral lobe and the eye. The medial cerebral artery, which comes from the internal carotid artery, and it supplies the lateral aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and the anterior communicating artery that supplies the cerebral arterial circle, and finally, the anterior cerebral artery that comes from the internal carotid, and it supplies the cerebral hemispheres. So again, this picture shows where these arteries are located. So that's all, guys. I hope you learned something from us, and thank you for listening. That's all.
Together, SPUP is song. Together, SPUP is our home. Together, SPUP is song. Together, SPUP is our home. Here and now, it's time to promote health. Committed to serve and care. Yeah. That's all our dreams have no limitations. That's what's all about. Yeah. Everyone is special in our own way. We'll make each other strong. We're all in it together. We are one, united as one. Your physicians, we're all in it together. Hand in hand to succeed as we stand.